Today we're going to be diagnosing a slight alignment problem with my Lexus ES. The problem I'm having is the steering wheel is always pulling slightly to the left no matter how I rotate the tires or take the car in for an alignment. Here we are on a straight stretch of highway. We're going at about 130 kilometers an hour. As you can see, the steering wheel is not exactly straight. If I release the steering wheel, the car kind of wanders off to the left. I feel like I'm constantly fighting the steering wheel to keep the car straight. As you see, when I step on the brake, there isn't any vibration or any pulling or anything. The next logical thing would be to check the front brakes and service them to make sure that the slider pins are sliding freely and not sticking, and that the pad wear is even. Then we're going to jack up the vehicle. Don't forget to put in your jack stands. Next we're going to take off the wheel. So this here is the brake assembly. This is the rotor. This is the caliper. To get to the brake pads underneath, we're going to need to remove two 14mm bolts. Remove that one. And remove that one. Next I'm going to carefully remove the caliper from the brake assembly. Then I can remove the brake pads, one here and the inner one here. To remove the rotor, we need to remove the caliper bracket, and that's held on by two 17mm bolts back here. So next we're going to remove the 17mm bolt, and then remove the upper 17mm bolt. That's the upper bolt. And then remove the lower bolt and the caliper bracket. Next I'm going to remove the brake rotor. Now if these rotors were deeply grooved, it would be time to remachine this rotor or replace it with a brand new one. So here we've got the inner and outer pad from the passenger side and inner and outer pad from the driver's side of the vehicle. Now if I pick these up and compare the sizes of the passenger pads, you can see that the inner pad is ever so slightly thinner than the outer pad, and that's just a function of how floating calipers work. Basically the inner pad grabs the rotor first and then the outer pad slides in from the other side. Now if your caliper pin or the caliper itself is sticking, that could cause this inner pad to keep contacting the rotor and therefore slightly applying the brakes as you're driving down the road, causing the vehicle to pull off in one direction. Now if I compare the wear on the driver's side, as you can see they're a little bit more evenly worn. However, there is still a lot of grooving and glazing that we're going to remove with sandpaper. Now as part of the brake service, I'm going to be rotating the brake pads to see if it has anything to do with the highway pull. So I'm going to be taking the inner passenger pad and rotating it to the outside of the driver, taking the outside of the driver and bringing it inside, taking the outside of the passenger and bringing it to the inside of the driver, and taking the inside of the driver and putting it to the outside of the passenger. Now because the surface of these are slightly glazed and grooved, we're going to need to sand this down as well as the rotor to make sure they bed in properly. So I'm just going to come in with a little bit of 80 grit sandpaper and sand these rotors down. You'll know you're done sanding when the surfaces are nice and smooth and that glaze is gone from the surface. Then I'm going to flip over the rotor and continue sanding the other side. Next we're going to remove the brake shims from the back of the brake pad and clean this up here with a little bit of brake cleaner. And use a rag and wipe that down. Now before you replace the brake pad, you might want to put a layer of brake lube on there if you have problems with the brake squealing. Next I'm going to use a piece of 80 grit sandpaper and sand off the glaze from the brake pads. You'll know you're done sanding when the glaze is gone from the brake pads. Next I'm going to use some brake cleaner and clean the surface of the brake pad and use a cloth and wipe it down. Next we're going to work on cleaning up the caliper bracket. I'm going to remove these guys right here. I'm going to use a bit of brake cleaner and an old cloth and clean these up here. Now if there's a lot of rust build up here, you can use a wire brush to clean things out. Next we're going to work on the sliding pins. Now if it takes quite a bit of force to take these out, you know that they're kind of stuck and that could be contributing to the brake grabbing problem, causing the pull. Now these are really stuck, so that tells me there's definitely a problem with the sliders. Okay, there we go. And there's the other one. Now if it's really rusted in there or the pin itself is really rusty, it might be time to actually replace the caliper bracket or the pin itself. I'm going to be using a little bit of brake cleaner, spray a little bit into the slider hole and a little bit on the end of this cloth, which is on my screwdriver, insert it into the hole and twist it to clean it out. Next we're going to work on cleaning up these brackets with the brake pad slide on. Use a little bit of brake cleaner and the rag and clean these out. Next I'm going to work on cleaning up these slider pins. I'm going to use again a little bit of brake cleaner and clean off all the lubricant. As you can see, there's a little bit of rust that's building up in this ridge here. I'm just going to use a little bit of a sandpaper and come in here to try to clean that up. Next I'm going to use a little bit of brake lube and apply it to the slider pin. and make sure it goes all the way around. And then I'm going to insert the pin into the caliper bracket like that, and insert this pin on this side. Make sure when you seat these slider pins in that the rubber catches on and it moves nice and freely. Next I'm going to replace these brackets that the brake pads slide on into the caliper bracket. Now I'm going to apply a little bit of anti-sieze on the surface where the brake pads are going to touch so that they can be lubricated properly. Here we have the brake caliper. I'm going to be cleaning up the surfaces that touch the back of the brake pads with some brake cleaner and then a rag. Then we're going to use either a C-clamp or a set of channel locks to compress the piston slightly. Make sure you double check the fluid level of the master cylinder reservoir after you've compressed the brake calipers. Before installing the brake rotor, I'm just going to go around with some brake cleaner and clean off any oily deposits. I'm just going to use a wire brush to clean up this hub before I install the rotor. Next I'm going to install the brake rotor, and then I'm going to use brake cleaner to clean the outside of the brake rotor. Always a good idea to put anti-sieze on the bolts before installing. Next I'm going to install the caliper bracket and then install the 17mm bolt. Then I'm going to use my 17mm ratchet to tighten this down nice and snug. Next I'm going to install the brake pads. You could put a little tip of anti-sieze on the ends of the brake pads so they slide in easier. This will now become the outer pad, and this will become the inner pad. I'm going to next install the brake caliper. Then I'm going to install the two 14mm caliper sliding bolts, and then use my 14mm ratchet to tighten this down and tighten the bottom one. A properly lubricated caliper should be able to move back and forth freely with no restriction. Another thing you might want to do as part of the brake service is to bleed the brakes. While the wheel is off is also a good time to inspect the suspension for any play, such as the tie rod ends, the stabilizer linkages or the bushings, as well as the drive shaft for any rips, tears or leaks, and the ball joint down there. Next I'm going to replace the wheel. Just tighten the wheels. And that's pretty much what's involved when you take your car in for a brake service. And before I start driving, I'm going to need to press the brake pedal a couple of times to get the calipers to retract back to their original position. Now before I can drive the vehicle and stop and go traffic, I'm going to need to bed the pads into the rotors. To do that I'm going to bring the vehicle up to speed here, and then slowly and lightly apply the brakes a couple of times. That will allow the pads to bed into the rotors evenly, as opposed to depositing material unevenly during heavy braking, which could cause brake vibrations. So here we are on the same stretch of highway. As you can see, when I release the steering wheel, the car is tracking mostly straight. That means that the issue is more due to the stuck slider pins or the uneven caliper wear, as opposed to an alignment or a tire issue.